The sound of metal grinding against metal pierced the dawn air as the freight train rounded the bend near Miller's Creek. What happened in those next 30 seconds would forever change two lives in ways neither could have imagined. When David Chen pulled his construction truck to the side of the tracks that morning, he thought he was just taking a shortcut to the job site. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He never expected to witness someone fighting for their life, thrown from a moving train like discarded cargo. The woman lay motionless in the tall grass, her coat torn, clutching nothing but a small leather purse. But what David discovered about her identity would shake him to his very core and reveal a miracle that had been 23 years in the making. The morning mist still clung to the railroad tracks when David Chen turned his pickup onto the old service road that ran parallel to the freight line. It was barely 6 in the morning, and the sun had just begun to paint the Kentucky hills in shades of amber and gold. He had taken this route hundreds of times over the past 5 years, ever since he started his small construction business. The shortcut saved him 20 minutes getting to the Morrison farm, where he was installing a new drainage system. And 20 minutes meant everything when you were a single father trying to squeeze every dollar out of every day. His coffee sat cooling in the cup holder, steam no longer rising from the black liquid that had become his lifeline through sleepless nights and early mornings. In the passenger seat, his toolbox rattled with each bump in the gravel road, a familiar sound that had become the soundtrack to his working life. David adjusted his baseball cap, the same faded blue one he had worn since his college days, and checked the clock on his dashboard. If he kept this pace, he would arrive at the Morrison place right on schedule, maybe even a few minutes early. The freight train's whistle echoed across the valley, a long mournful sound that seemed to vibrate through the morning air. David glanced toward the tracks, watching the massive locomotive pull its chain of cargo cars through the landscape like a metal serpent. He had always found something peaceful about trains, the way they moved with such purpose and power, carrying their loads from one destination to another without hesitation or doubt. There was a reliability to them that appealed to his practical nature, a sense that they knew exactly where they were going and how to get there. But as the train began to pass alongside his truck, something caught his eye that made him slow down and peer more carefully through his windshield. There was commotion near one of the freight cars, shadows moving in ways that seemed wrong, unnatural. At first, he thought it might be railroad workers performing some kind of maintenance. But the movements were too erratic, too frantic. Someone was struggling. David pressed on the brake and brought his truck to a complete stop, rolling down his window to get a better view. The sound of the train was deafening now, metal wheels grinding against steel rails, the entire earth seeming to vibrate with the weight and momentum of the massive machine. But above that mechanical roar, he heard something else, something that made his blood run cold. A human voice crying out in distress. A figure appeared at the open door of one of the freight cars, silhouetted against the dim interior. It was a woman, and she was not alone. 2 larger figures seemed to be grappling with her, their movements aggressive and purposeful. David's heart began to race as he realized what he was witnessing. This was not a railroad accident or mechanical problem. This was something far more sinister. The woman broke free for a moment, and David could see her more clearly now. She appeared to be middle-aged, with dark hair that whipped around her face in the wind. Her clothes were torn, and even from his distance, he could see the desperation in her posture as she fought against her attackers. She was trying to get away from them, but there was nowhere to go except out of the moving train. David grabbed his cell phone and started to dial 911, but before he could complete the call, the unthinkable happened. The woman was pushed, or perhaps she jumped, from the open door of the freight car. Her body tumbled through the air for what seemed like an eternity before hitting the ground with a sickening impact. She rolled several times down the embankment before coming to rest in a patch of tall grass and wildflowers that grew alongside the tracks. Without thinking, David threw his truck into park and jumped out, leaving the engine running and the door wide open. His work boots pounded against the gravel as he ran toward the place where the woman had fallen. Behind him, the freight train continued its relentless journey, the car where the struggle had taken place now disappearing around a distant curve as if nothing had happened at all. The embankment was steeper than it had looked from the road, and David half ran, half slid down the slope, his hands reaching out to steady himself against small trees and bushes. His heart was hammering in his chest, and 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. Was she alive? How badly was she hurt? Should he move her or wait for paramedics? He had basic first aid training from his construction work, but this was far beyond anything he had ever encountered. He found her lying on her side in a small clearing, her body unnaturally still. Her coat, which had once been a deep burgundy color, was now torn and stained with dirt and grass. One shoe was missing, and her hair had fallen across her face in tangled strands. For a terrifying moment, David thought she might be dead, but then he saw the slight rise and fall of her chest and heard the shallow sound of her breathing. He knelt beside her carefully, afraid to move her but needing to assess her condition. Her eyes were closed, and a small trickle of blood ran from a cut on her forehead. Her left arm was bent at an odd angle, probably broken, and her clothes were torn in several places. But she was breathing, and that gave him hope. David pulled out his phone again, and this time successfully dialed 911. When the operator answered, his words came out in a rush. He explained what he had witnessed, gave his location as best he could, and requested both police and ambulance services. The operator assured him that help was on the way and instructed him to stay with the woman, but not to move her unless she was in immediate danger. As he waited for the emergency responders to arrive, David found himself studying the woman's face more closely. There was something familiar about her features, though he could not place where he might have seen her before. She appeared to be in her late 40s or early 50s, with olive skin and dark eyebrows that gave her face a strong, determined look even in unconsciousness. Her hands, which lay partially open beside her, were well cared for, but bore the calluses of someone who was no stranger to hard work. A small leather purse lay nearby, apparently thrown clear when she fell. David glanced at it but did not touch it, knowing that it might contain identification that could help the police understand what had happened. Whatever had occurred on that train, it was clear that this woman had been the victim of some kind of violence, and David found himself wondering what circumstances could have led to such a desperate situation. The sound of sirens in the distance brought him back to the present moment. He looked down at the woman again and was surprised to see that her eyes had opened. They were dark brown, almost black, and filled with confusion and pain. She tried to speak, but only a weak whisper emerged from her lips. David leaned closer, trying to catch her words. What she said made him freeze in place, his blood turning to ice in his veins. The woman, barely conscious and clearly in agony, had whispered a single word that changed everything he thought he knew about this situation. She had whispered his name. Not just any name, but his specific name, spoken with a familiarity that suggested she knew exactly who he was. But David was certain he had never seen this woman before in his life. How could she possibly know who he was? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And why would she speak his name in what might be her final moments? Before he could process this revelation fully, the paramedics arrived, their ambulance bumping carefully down the service road before stopping as close to the embankment as possible. 2 EMTs, a man and a woman, hurried down the slope with their equipment, immediately taking charge of the situation. David stepped back to give them room to work, but his mind was spinning with questions that seemed to have no logical answers. The male paramedic, whose name tag read Johnson, began checking the woman's vital signs while his partner, Rodriguez, assessed her injuries. They worked with practiced efficiency, asking David quick questions about what he had witnessed while simultaneously treating their patient. David told them about seeing her thrown or pushed from the train, but he did not mention that she had spoken his name. Something instinctive told him to keep that detail to himself for now. As the paramedics worked, David noticed that the woman's eyes kept drifting back to his face whenever she was conscious. There was something in her gaze, a mixture of recognition and desperate urgency, as if she was trying to communicate something important, but lacked the strength to speak. Each time their eyes met, David felt a strange jolt of connection, a sense that this encounter was not the random act of Good Samaritanism it appeared to be. The police arrived shortly after the ambulance, 2 officers and a county sheriff's cruiser, who immediately began securing the scene and taking David's statement. Officer Martinez, a compact woman with graying hair and sharp eyes, listened intently as David recounted what he had seen. She asked detailed questions about the men on the train, their approximate ages and builds, and whether he had seen any weapons or heard any specific threats. David answered as completely as he could, but he found himself holding back the detail about the woman knowing his name. He told himself it was because she might have been delirious from her injuries, that hearing his name could have been a hallucination or coincidence. But deep down, he knew there was more to it than that. Something about this entire situation felt deeply personal in a way he could not yet understand. Officer Martinez's partner, a younger man named Officer Blake, was examining the area where the woman had fallen, looking for evidence that might help identify her attackers or explain what had happened on the train. He found her missing shoe about 20 feet away and carefully bagged it as evidence. He also located her purse, which David had noticed earlier, and began the process of documenting its contents. The paramedics had stabilized the woman and were preparing to transport her to the hospital. As they loaded her onto a stretcher, she became conscious again and immediately began searching the faces around her until she found David. Once again, her lips moved as if she was trying to speak, but this time Officer Martinez was close enough to hear. The woman whispered something that made the officer's eyebrows rise in surprise. She leaned closer to the stretcher and asked the woman to repeat what she had said. The response was weak but clear enough for both David and Officer Martinez to hear distinctly. The woman had said, "Tell David. Tell him about Emma." David felt the world tilt around him at the mention of that name. Emma. His daughter Emma, who had been taken from him 23 years ago when she was just 2 years old. Emma, whose disappearance had destroyed his marriage and nearly destroyed his life. Emma, whom he had never stopped looking for despite the passage of decades and the insistence of everyone around him that she was gone forever. Officer Martinez turned to David with a puzzled expression. "Do you know what she's talking about? Who is Emma?" David's mouth was dry as desert sand. He tried to speak but found that no words would come. How could this stranger, this victim of an apparent crime, know about Emma? How could she possibly know the name of his long-lost daughter? The paramedics were growing impatient, needing to get their patient to the hospital for proper medical treatment. Officer Martinez made a quick decision and told David that they would need him to come to the station later to provide a more detailed statement. She handed him her card and asked him to call within the next few hours to arrange a time to meet. As the ambulance pulled away, its sirens wailing as it headed toward the county hospital, David stood alone on the gravel road beside his still-running truck. The morning that had started as an ordinary trip to a construction job had transformed into something that challenged everything he thought he knew about his life and his past. He climbed back into his truck and sat for several minutes, trying to process what had just occurred. The woman's words echoed in his mind. Tell David. About Emma. How could she know? What did she know? And most importantly, was it possible that after all these years of searching and hoping and grieving, he might finally learn what had happened to his little girl? David's hands shook as he reached for his phone to call his foreman and explain that he would not be making it to the Morrison farm that day. There were more important things to deal with now, questions that needed answers, and a mystery that seemed to reach back through the decades to touch the deepest wound in his heart. 23 years ago, David Chen had been a different man entirely. He was 28 years old, recently married to his college sweetheart Lisa, and working as a junior architect for a firm in Louisville. They lived in a small but comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood where children played in the streets and neighbors knew each other's names. Life was good, filled with the promise of a bright future and the joy of raising their beautiful daughter Emma. Emma had been the light of David's life from the moment she was born. She had inherited her mother's delicate features and David's dark hair, and she possessed a personality that was entirely her own. Even as a toddler, she was curious about everything, constantly asking questions and exploring her environment with the fearless enthusiasm that only small children seem to possess. David remembered coming home from work each evening to find Emma waiting for him at the front window, her small face pressed against the glass as she watched for his car. The moment he pulled into the driveway, she would disappear from the window and come running to meet him at the door, her arms outstretched and her voice calling, "Daddy, Daddy," in the pure, joyful tone that never failed to make his heart swell with love. Those had been the golden days, when David's biggest worry was whether Emma would sleep through the night or if they needed to child-proof another cabinet. He and Lisa would lie in bed at night, talking about their dreams for their daughter's future, imagining the schools she would attend, the talents she might develop, the person she would become. But all of that changed on a Tuesday afternoon in October when David's world collapsed with a single phone call. He had been in a meeting with clients, reviewing plans for a new office building, when his secretary knocked on the conference room door with an apologetic expression. She whispered that there was an emergency call from his wife, and David's first thought was that Emma had been hurt in some kind of accident. Children that age were constantly falling off swings or bumping into furniture, and Lisa might be calling from the emergency room. But when David picked up the phone, Lisa's voice was unlike anything he had ever heard before. She was crying so hard that he could barely understand her words, and what he did understand made no sense at all. "She's gone," Lisa sobbed into the phone. "David, Emma's gone. I can't find her anywhere." David's mind immediately went to practical explanations. Emma had probably wandered off while Lisa was distracted, maybe hidden in a closet or crawled under a bed for a nap. 2-year-olds were notorious for finding creative hiding places that could terrify their parents. "Calm down," David said, already grabbing his jacket and car keys. "I'm coming home. Have you checked all her usual hiding spots? Under the stairs? Behind the couch?" "I've looked everywhere," Lisa cried. "David, I think someone took her." The clung front door was open when I came downstairs from folding laundry. I was only gone for 15 minutes, maybe 20. She was playing with her blocks in the living room, and when I came back down, she was gone and the door was wide open. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of David's life. He broke every speed limit and ran through at least 2 red lights, his mind racing through scenarios that grew progressively more terrifying. By the time he reached his neighborhood, police cars were already lining his street, their red and blue lights flashing in the afternoon sun. What followed were the worst weeks of David's life. The police launched an immediate search, interviewing neighbors, checking with relatives, and issuing an Amber Alert that spread Emma's photograph across the region. David and Lisa barely slept, spending their days coordinating with law enforcement, and their nights walking the streets, calling Emma's name until their voices were hoarse. The investigation revealed very little concrete evidence. There were no signs of forced entry to the house, no witnesses who had seen anything suspicious, and no ransom demands from potential kidnappers. Emma had simply vanished as if she had never existed at all. As weeks turned into months, the active search began to wind down. The police assured David and Lisa that Emma's case would remain open, but it was clear that without new leads or evidence, there was little more they could do. The FBI had been involved from the beginning, given the possibility of kidnapping across state lines, but even their resources and expertise had failed to produce any meaningful progress. The strain of Emma's disappearance destroyed David and Lisa's marriage within 2 years. They had tried counseling, tried grief support groups, tried taking vacations to places that held no memories of their daughter. But the loss was too great, the guilt too overwhelming, and the constant reminder of what they had lost too painful to bear together. Lisa blamed herself for leaving Emma alone, even for those few minutes. David blamed himself for not being there to protect his family. They blamed each other in quiet, unspoken ways that poisoned their relationship until they could barely stand to be in the same room. Eventually, Lisa moved back to her parents' home in California, and David was left alone with his grief and his relentless determination to find his daughter. In the years that followed, David had become something of an expert on missing children cases. He maintained contact with several private investigators, subscribed to databases that tracked unidentified children, and had spent countless hours researching leads that inevitably led nowhere. He had traveled to different states to investigate sightings that turned out to be false alarms, and he had networked with other parents who were living the same nightmare. As time passed, well-meaning friends and family members had urged David to accept that Emma was probably dead, to move on with his life and perhaps start a new family. But David could never bring himself to believe that his daughter was gone forever. Somewhere deep in his heart, he maintained a stubborn faith that she was still alive, that she was growing up somewhere, and that someday, somehow, they would be reunited. When David married Sarah 8 years ago, he had been upfront about his ongoing search for Emma. Sarah, a kind and understanding woman who worked as a nurse at the local hospital, had accepted that part of David's life with remarkable grace. She understood that his search for his first daughter would always be a priority, and she had even helped him organize some of his research and maintain his files. Their son Michael, now 12 years old, had grown up knowing about his half-sister, Emma, though David tried not to burden the boy with the weight of the family's tragic history. Michael knew that his father had another daughter somewhere, and that finding her was important to their family, but David had worked hard to ensure that Michael never felt like he was living in Emma's shadow. Now, as David sat in his truck beside the railroad tracks where a mysterious woman had spoken his daughter's name, all of those years of searching and hoping seemed to converge into this single impossible moment. The woman in the ambulance somehow knew about Emma. She had information, or at least she claimed to have information, about the daughter who had been missing for 23 years. David started his truck and began the drive toward the county hospital, his mind racing with possibilities and fears in equal measure. Was it possible that this woman actually knew something about Emma's disappearance? Could she have information about what had happened to his daughter all those years ago? Or was this some kind of cruel coincidence, a delirious woman speaking random names that happened to match his deepest pain? There was only one way to find out, and that was to talk to the woman as soon as she was conscious and coherent enough to explain what she knew. David pressed down on the accelerator, suddenly desperate to reach the hospital and get answers to questions that had haunted him for more than 2 decades. The drive to County General Hospital usually took about 30 minutes from the railroad crossing, but David made it in 22. He parked in the visitor's lot and hurried through the automatic doors into the emergency department waiting room, a sterile space filled with uncomfortable plastic chairs and the constant background noise of medical equipment and urgent conversations. At the information desk, David explained to the receptionist that he was the Good Samaritan who had found the woman by the railroad tracks and that the police had asked him to check on her condition. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and tired expression, made a phone call and then directed David to a small consultation room where he could wait for an update from the attending physician, Dr. Patel, a slight man in his 50s, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, entered the consultation room about 20 minutes later. He introduced himself and thanked David for his quick action in calling for help. "The woman you found is in stable condition," Dr. Patel explained. "She has a concussion, a fractured left arm, several bruised ribs, and numerous cuts and abrasions, consistent with a fall from a moving vehicle. She's conscious now, though still somewhat disoriented. She's been asking for someone named David." David's heart skipped a beat. "She's been asking for me?" Dr. Patel nodded. "She seems quite insistent about speaking with you. Ordinarily, we would limit visitors to immediate family members, but Officer Martinez called and explained the circumstances. She felt it might be important for you to speak with the patient, given that she appears to know you somehow." David was led through a maze of hospital corridors to a room in the trauma unit. Outside the door, Officer Martinez was waiting with a small notebook and a concerned expression. She looked up when David approached and gestured for him to join her in a quiet alcove. "Before you go in there," Officer Martinez said, "I need to tell you what we've learned about her identity. Her name is Maria Santos, and according to the identification in her purse, she's 49 years old and lives in Chicago. We ran her through the system, and she has no criminal record, but there are some interesting details about her background." David waited, his heart pounding with anticipation and anxiety. "Maria Santos is a social worker who specializes in cases involving missing children and family reunification," Officer Martinez continued. "She's worked for the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services for over 15 years. What's particularly interesting is that she was traveling on that freight train unofficially, apparently without proper authorization. The railroad company has no record of her having permission to be on that train." David felt his legs grow weak. A social worker who dealt with missing children, who somehow knew his name and his daughter's name, who had been thrown from a train under mysterious circumstances. The coincidences were too numerous and too specific to be explained by chance. "There's more," Officer Martinez said. "We contacted her employer in Chicago, and they told us that Maria took emergency leave last week to pursue what she called a breakthrough in an old case. She didn't give them details, but she said it involved a missing child case that had personal significance for her." David's mouth was dry as he tried to process this information. "Can I talk to her now?" Officer Martinez nodded and opened the door to Maria's room. Inside, the woman David had found by the railroad tracks was lying in a hospital bed, her left arm in a cast and her head wrapped in bandages. But her dark eyes were alert and focused, and when she saw David enter the room, her expression showed immediate recognition and relief. "David," she said, her voice weak but clear, "thank God you found me. I was so afraid I wouldn't be able to tell you." David approached the bed slowly, his hands trembling with nervous energy. "Tell me what? How do you know my name? How do you know about Emma?" Maria's eyes filled with tears, and she struggled to sit up straighter in the bed. "Because she said," her voice barely above a whisper, "I've been searching for you for 6 months. I know what happened to your daughter, David. I know where Emma is." The silence in the hospital room stretched like a taut wire between David and Maria Santos. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implications that seemed too enormous to comprehend. David stared at the woman in the hospital bed, searching her bruised face for any sign of deception or delusion. But all he saw was a profound sadness mixed with desperate urgency. Officer Martinez stepped closer to the bed, her pen poised over her notebook. The revelation about Emma had transformed this from a simple assault case into something far more complex and personal. She needed to understand the connection between this injured social worker and David's long-lost daughter before she could determine how to proceed with her investigation. David's voice came out as barely more than a whisper when he finally managed to speak. "You said you know what happened to Emma. What do you mean? Is she alive?" Maria's eyes closed for a moment, and when she opened them again, tears were streaming down her cheeks. "She's alive, David. Your daughter is alive, and she's been living less than 200 miles from here for the past 20 years. The words hit David like a physical blow. He grabbed the back of a nearby chair to steady himself, his knees threatening to buckle under the weight of this revelation. 20 years. Emma had been alive and relatively close to home for 20 years while he had been searching desperately across the entire country. "That's impossible," David said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The FBI searched everywhere. Every state, every database, every possible lead. How could she have been so close and nobody found her?" Maria struggled to sit up further in her hospital bed, wincing as the movement aggravated her injuries. "Because she wasn't listed in any of the databases you would have been searching. She wasn't in the foster care system, she wasn't reported as a found child, and she wasn't living under her real name." Officer Martinez leaned forward. "What name was she living under?" "Emma Rodriguez," Maria said. "She was adopted illegally when she was 2 years old by a couple named Carlos and Isabel Rodriguez. They believed they were saving her from an abusive situation. They had no idea she had been kidnapped." David felt the room spinning around. Him, adopted illegally? By who? How? Maria took a shaky breath, clearly struggling with the effort of speaking for extended periods. "The man who took Emma from your house wasn't a random kidnapper. David, his name was Thomas Kellerman, and he was running what we now know was a sophisticated child trafficking operation disguised as a private adoption agency." The name meant nothing to David, but Officer Martinez was writing furiously in her notebook. This was clearly information that would need to be shared with federal authorities immediately. Kellerman targeted families where he could create opportunities to take children, Maria continued. He would study neighborhoods, learn family routines, and identify houses where children might be left unsupervised for brief periods. "Your wife Lisa wasn't negligent, David. Kellerman had been watching your family for weeks, waiting for exactly the kind of opportunity that occurred that day." David sank into the chair he had been gripping, his mind reeling. But why Emma? Why our family? "Because Emma fit the profile of what his clients were looking for," Maria said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "A healthy, intelligent toddler with no obvious medical or developmental issues. Kellerman had buyers lined up, people who were willing to pay enormous amounts of money for children who met specific criteria." Officer Martinez looked up from her notes. "You said the couple who adopted Emma thought they were helping her. What did they believe happened to her?" Maria's expression softened slightly. "Kellerman told the Rodriguez family that Emma was the daughter of a teenage mother who had died in a car accident. He said the girl's family couldn't care for Emma and wanted her to go to a loving home. Carlos and Isabel had been trying to have children for years without success, and they jumped at the chance to adopt a baby, even through unofficial channels." David was struggling to process the enormity of what he was hearing. "So Emma has been living with this Rodriguez family all these years? They've been raising her as their own daughter?" "Yes," Maria nodded. "And from everything I've been able to determine, they've been wonderful parents to her. They love her deeply, and she loves them." They moved to a small town in southern Indiana about a year after the adoption, where Carlos found work as a mechanic and Isabel became a teacher. Emma grew up there, went to school there, and as far as she knows, Carlos and Isabel are her biological parents. The implications of this hit David like a sledgehammer. His daughter had been living a happy, normal life with another family while He had been torturing himself with fears about what terrible fate might have befallen her. She had been safe and loved and cared for, but she had no idea who she really was, or that her biological father had been searching for her every day for 23 years. Does she know? David asked. Does Emma know she was adopted? Maria shook her head. No, the Rodriguez family never told her the truth about how she came to be with them. As far as Emma knows, she's their biological daughter. She has no idea that she was taken from another family or that you exist. David buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by a mixture of relief, joy, anger, and profound sadness. His daughter was alive and well, which was more than he had dared to hope for in recent years. But she was also a complete stranger to him, a 25-year-old woman who had lived an entire life without him, who had no knowledge of his existence or his love for her. Officer Martinez was focused on the criminal aspects of the situation. How did you discover all of this? And what does it have to do with what happened to you on that train? Maria's expression grew darker. I've been investigating child trafficking networks for the past 3 years as part of a federal task force. About 6 months ago, we got a break in a case involving Thomas Kellerman's operation. He died in prison 5 years ago, but before he died, he gave information to another inmate about some of his unsolved cases in exchange for protection. She paused to catch her breath, the effort of speaking clearly taking its toll on her injured body. That inmate was released 3 months ago and contacted authorities with Kellerman's information, hoping to get a reduced sentence on his own charges. One of the cases Kellerman had mentioned involved a 2-year-old girl taken from Kentucky in 2001 and placed with a family in Indiana. David looked up sharply. Emma. Yes, Maria confirmed. When I saw the details of the case, I knew immediately that it matched your daughter's disappearance. The timing, the location, the age, everything fit perfectly. I started investigating on my own time, trying to track down what had happened to the child Kellerman had placed. Officer Martinez frowned. Why didn't you contact Mr. Chen immediately? Or work through official channels? Maria's expression became complicated, filled with guilt and frustration. Because I knew that if I went through official channels, it would take months or even years to get approval for an investigation. The bureaucracy involved in interstate cases, especially ones involving illegal adoptions, is nightmarish. And I also knew that once the authorities got involved, Emma's life would be turned upside down immediately. She looked directly at David. I wanted to be absolutely certain that I had the right family before I contacted you. I couldn't bear the thought of giving you false hope again. You've suffered enough. David was beginning to understand the depth of Maria's commitment to his case. So you've been investigating Emma's whereabouts on your own time? For the past 6 months, Maria nodded. I tracked down the Rodriguez family in Indiana, confirmed that they had a daughter who matched Emma's description and age, and began trying to find a way to approach the situation delicately. I knew that this revelation would destroy multiple lives if it wasn't handled carefully. Officer Martinez was still focused on the immediate crime. But what does this have to do with you being thrown from a train? Who were those men who attacked you? Maria's face grew pale, and for the first time since David had entered the room, she looked genuinely frightened. That's where things get complicated and dangerous. It turns out that Thomas Kellerman's child trafficking network didn't die with him. Other people took over his operation, and they're still active. David felt a chill run down his spine. You mean there are still people out there kidnapping children? Yes, Maria said grimly. And when I started investigating Emma's case, I inadvertently stumbled onto evidence of their current activities. They've been watching me for weeks, trying to figure out how much I know and who I've shared information with. Officer Martinez leaned forward intently. What kind of evidence? Financial records mostly, Maria explained. I was able to trace some of the money that the Rodriguez family paid for Emma's adoption. They thought they were paying legal fees and administrative costs, but the money actually went into accounts that are still being used today for similar transactions. She paused, clearly struggling with whether to reveal more details. There's a network of people involved in this operation. Lawyers, social workers, doctors, even some law enforcement officials. They've been operating for decades, and they have connections everywhere. David was beginning to understand why Maria had been targeted. You were getting too close to exposing them. Exactly, Maria confirmed. I received threats 3 weeks ago, telling me to stop my investigation into old adoption cases. When I ignored the threats and continued my research, they decided to take more direct action. Officer Martinez was writing rapidly, clearly realizing that this case had implications far beyond a simple assault. Who specifically threatened you? Do you have names? Maria hesitated for a moment, then reached for the small table beside her hospital bed. My purse, she said. There should be a small notebook in my purse. Everything I've discovered about the network is documented in there. Officer Martinez retrieved Maria's purse from the closet where it had been stored and found the notebook. As she flipped through its pages, her expression grew increasingly serious. The notebook contained names, dates, financial information, and what appeared to be a detailed organizational chart of a criminal network. This is extensive, Officer Martinez said. We're going to need to get federal authorities involved immediately. This is way beyond the scope of a local investigation. David was still focused on his daughter. What about Emma? If these people are still active, is she in danger? Maria shook her head. I don't think so. Emma's adoption happened 23 years ago, and it's unlikely that anyone would take action against her now. The people who attacked me are more concerned about protecting their current operations than covering up old cases. She looked at David with compassion in her eyes. But David, you need to understand that approaching Emma is going to be incredibly complicated. She has no idea about any of this. As far as she knows, Carlos and Isabel Rodriguez are her parents, and she's living a normal life in Indiana. David stood up and began pacing the small hospital room, his mind racing with the implications of everything he had learned. His daughter was alive, which was wonderful beyond words, but she was also a stranger living under a false identity with no knowledge of her true origins. Approaching her with this information could destroy her world just as much as it might. Heal his. What would you advise? David asked Maria. How do we handle this without traumatizing Emma or destroying her relationship with the people who raised her? Maria was quiet for a long moment, clearly having wrestled with this question during her months of investigation. I think the first step is to contact Emma's adoptive parents, Carlos and Isabel. They deserve to know the truth about how they came to adopt Emma, and they need to be part of any decision about how to approach her with this information. Officer Martinez looked up from the notebook. Assuming they're innocent victims in this situation. I believe they are, Maria said firmly. Everything I've learned about the Rodriguez family suggests that they were deceived by Kellerman. Just as much as David was victimized by him. They paid what they thought were legal adoption fees. They were given falsified documents, and they've raised Emma with love and care for over 20 years. David stopped pacing and turned to face Maria. Have you had any contact with them? Do they know you've been investigating? No, Maria shook her head. I was planning to approach them this week after I had finished gathering all of my evidence. That's why I was on that train. I was traveling to Indiana to meet with them in person. Officer Martinez frowned. Why were you on a freight train? That's not exactly normal passenger transportation. Maria's expression became complicated again. Because I knew I was being followed. The people who have been threatening me have connections in law enforcement and transportation. I thought if I traveled on a freight train, using routes that weren't monitored the same way as passenger trains or airlines, I might be able to reach Indiana without being detected. David realized the courage that Maria had shown in pursuing his daughter's case. She had risked her career, her safety, and ultimately her life to bring him this information. Why? He asked simply. Why did you go to such lengths for a case that wasn't even officially assigned to you? Maria's eyes filled with tears again. Because I have a daughter too, David. She's 16 now, and I can't imagine what I would go through if someone took her from me. When I read about your case, about how you've never stopped looking for Emma, it broke my heart. She wiped her eyes with her uninjured hand. But there's more to it than that. My daughter Sophia was adopted too, though through legitimate channels. I've spent my entire career working with families who have been separated by the system, and I know how important it is for children to know their true origins when possible. David sat back down in the chair beside Maria's bed, feeling overwhelmed by gratitude toward this woman who had sacrificed so much to help reunite him with his daughter. What happens now? How do we move forward? Before Maria could answer, there was a knock on the hospital room door. Officer Martinez opened it to find a man in a dark suit with federal credentials hanging from his jacket pocket. He introduced himself as Agent Thompson from the FBI and explained that he had been contacted about Maria's case by the local police department. Agent Thompson's presence immediately changed the dynamic in the room. He listened intently as Officer Martinez briefed him on what they had learned about the child trafficking network and Maria's investigation into Emma's case. He examined Maria's notebook and asked detailed questions about the evidence she had gathered. Ms. Santos, Agent Thompson said when Officer Martinez had finished her briefing, you've uncovered information about an ongoing federal investigation. We've been tracking this network for 2 years, but we haven't had access to the historical cases that you've documented. Maria looked surprised. You're already investigating them? We are, Agent Thompson confirmed. But we've been focused on their current activities. The information you've gathered about their historical operations could be crucial to building a comprehensive case against them. He turned to David. Mr. Chen, I understand that this investigation has revealed information about your missing daughter. I want you to know that reuniting you with Emma is a priority for us, but we need to coordinate our approach carefully to ensure everyone's safety. David nodded, though he was growing impatient with the procedural aspects of the situation. All he wanted was to see his daughter, to know that she was safe and well, and to begin the process of rebuilding the relationship that had been stolen from them 23 years ago. Agent Thompson continued, the people who attacked Miss Santos are still at large, and they represent a significant threat to anyone involved in exposing their operation. We need to make sure that contacting Emma and her adoptive family doesn't put them in danger. Maria struggled to sit up straighter in her hospital bed. Agent Thompson, I have contact information for Carlos and Isabel Rodriguez in my notebook. I was planning to approach them this week to explain the situation and ask for their cooperation in reuniting Emma with David. We'll handle that contact, Agent Thompson said firmly. This is now part of an active federal investigation, and all communication with potential witnesses needs to go through official channels. David felt frustration rising in his chest. How long is that going to take? I've been waiting 23 years to find my daughter. I can't wait months or years for bureaucratic processes to play out. Agent Thompson's expression softened. Slightly. I understand your urgency, Mr. Chen, but we need to do this right. If we approach this situation carelessly, we could endanger Emma, her adoptive family, and potentially compromise our investigation into the people who are still actively trafficking children. The agent pulled out his business card and handed it to David. I'm going to ask you to be patient for just a little while longer. Give us 1 week to coordinate with the Indiana authorities and develop a safe approach to contacting the Rodriguez family. After that, we'll work with you to arrange a meeting with Emma. David looked at the card in his hand, then at Maria lying injured in the hospital bed. This woman had risked everything to bring him information about his daughter, and now federal agents were taking over the case. He understood the need for caution and proper procedures, but the thought of waiting even one more week to learn about Emma's life felt almost unbearable. 1 week, David said finally. But after that, with or without official approval, I'm going to Indiana to find my daughter. Agent Thompson nodded. Fair enough. And Mr. Chen, I want you to know that we take this case very seriously. Your daughter's kidnapping was a federal crime, and the people responsible for trafficking her will face justice. After Agent Thompson left, the hospital room felt strangely quiet. David sat beside Maria's bed, both of them processing the magnitude of what had been revealed and what lay ahead. Officer Martinez remained as well, finishing her initial report and coordinating with federal authorities. David, Maria said softly, there's something else I need to tell you about Emma. David looked up, not sure he could handle any more revelations. She's a teacher, Maria said with a small smile. She teaches elementary school in a small town called Millbrook, about 30 miles south of Indianapolis. She's married to a man named James Walker, and they have 2 children together. David's breath caught in his throat. I'm a grandfather, Maria nodded. A little boy named Alex who's 4 years old, and a baby girl named Lily who's just 6 months old. From everything I was able to learn about Emma, she's a wonderful mother and a beloved teacher in her community. The thought of Emma having children of her own filled David with a complex mixture of joy and profound sadness. He was thrilled to know that his daughter had built a happy life for herself, but he was also heartbroken to realize how much of her life he had missed. He had missed her childhood, her adolescence, her wedding, the births of her children, and countless other milestones that could never be recovered. Does she look like me? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maria reached for her purse again and pulled out a small photograph. I took this from a distance when I was doing surveillance on her family. I hope you don't mind. David took the photograph with trembling hands. It showed a young woman with dark hair walking out of an elementary school building, holding hands with a small boy who appeared to be about 4 years old. Even from a distance, and despite the 23 years that had passed, David could see his own features in the woman's face. Emma had his nose and his chin, but her eyes and smile seemed to come from her mother Lisa. Tears streamed down David's face as he stared at the photograph. This was his daughter, grown up and living a life he knew nothing about. She was beautiful and clearly happy, surrounded by the family she had built for herself. But she was also a stranger, someone he would have passed on the street without recognition. She looks like both of us, David said, thinking of Lisa. She has her mother's smile. Maria nodded. I could see the resemblance to the photographs of you from 23 years ago that were in the case files. There's no doubt that this is your daughter, David. David carefully tucked the photograph into his wallet, next to the baby pictures of Emma that he had carried with him for over 2 decades. The contrast between the toddler he remembered and the adult woman in the recent photograph was a stark reminder of all the time that had been lost. Officer Martinez stood up from her chair. I need to get back to the station and coordinate with Agent Thompson's team. David, we'll need you to come in tomorrow to provide a more detailed statement about what you witnessed at the railroad tracks. After Officer Martinez left, David and Maria sat together in comfortable silence for several minutes. The afternoon sun was streaming through the hospital room window, casting long shadows across the floor. David felt emotionally exhausted from the revelations of the day, but he also felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Thank you, David said finally. I don't know how to adequately express my gratitude for what you've done. You've given me back my daughter. Maria shook her head. I haven't given her back to you yet, David. That's going to be the hardest part of all of this. Emma has lived her entire adult life without knowing about you. She has parents she loves, a husband, children, a career, a community. Learning the truth about her origins is going to turn her world upside down. David nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. What do you think will happen when she finds out? I don't know, Maria admitted. Every person reacts differently to this kind of revelation. Some adopted children are eager to connect with their biological families. Others feel angry or betrayed or confused. Emma will need time to process the information and decide how she wants to handle the relationship with you. David stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot below. What if she doesn't want to see me? What if learning about her kidnapping traumatizes her or damages her relationship with the people who raised her? Those are all possibilities, Maria said gently. But David, you can't let fear of her reaction prevent you from trying to reconnect with her. Emma deserves to know the truth about her origins, and you deserve the chance to know your daughter. David turned back to Maria. How do we make sure this goes as smoothly as possible for everyone involved? We start with Carlos and Isabel Rodriguez, Maria said. They're the key to all of this. If we can convince them to support a reunion between you and Emma, it will make the process much easier for everyone. If they feel threatened or defensive, it could create a situation where Emma feels forced to choose between her biological family and her adoptive family. David returned to his chair beside Maria's bed. Tell me about them. What kind of people are Carlos and Isabel? Maria's expression softened. From everything I was able to learn about them, they're good people who genuinely love Emma. Carlos works as the head mechanic at a local auto repair shop, and Isabel teaches second grade at the same elementary school where Emma works. They're respected members of their community. They've been married for over 30 years, and Emma is their only child. She paused, gathering her thoughts. They're not wealthy, but they provided Emma with a stable, loving home. They supported her through college, celebrated her achievements, and have been involved grandparents to her children. In every meaningful way, except biology, they are Emma's real parents. David felt a complex mixture of emotions at this description. He was grateful that Emma had been raised by people who loved her, but he also felt a deep sense of loss for the parenting experience that had been stolen from him. Do you think they'll be willing to work with us? I think they will, Maria said hopefully. When they learn that Emma was kidnapped rather than legitimately adopted, I believe they'll want to do what's right for everyone involved. They love Emma, and they'll want her to have the opportunity to know her biological father if that's what she chooses. David was quiet for several minutes, processing everything he had learned and trying to imagine how the reunion with his daughter might unfold. What's she like? As a person, I mean. What kind of woman did she become? Maria smiled for the first time since David had entered the hospital room. From what I was able to observe and learn about her, Emma is a remarkable woman. She's patient and kind with her students, devoted to her family, and well-liked in her community. She volunteers at the local animal shelter, coaches youth soccer, and organizes fundraisers for the school district. David felt his heart swelling with pride. For the daughter he had never known, she sounds wonderful. She is, Maria confirmed. She's everything you would want your daughter to be. David, she's grown into a strong, compassionate, successful woman who makes a positive difference in the lives of everyone around her. As the afternoon wore on, David and Maria continued to talk about Emma, about the investigation that had brought them together, and about the uncertain future that lay ahead. David learned that Maria had 2 daughters of her own, both adopted through legitimate channels, and that her own experiences as an adoptive mother had motivated her dedication to reunification cases. When visiting hours ended and David was forced to leave the hospital, he felt as though his entire world had shifted on its axis. 24 hours earlier, he had been a single father living with the constant pain of not knowing what had happened to his daughter. Now he knew that Emma was alive, safe, and living a good life just a few hours away from him. But he also knew that the most challenging part of this journey was still ahead. Reuniting with Emma would require delicate negotiations with multiple families, careful coordination with federal investigators, and most importantly, respect for Emma's autonomy and emotional well-being. As David drove home to his son Michael and his wife Sarah, he tried to imagine how he would explain the day's revelations to his current family. Michael had grown up knowing about his half-sister Emma, but the reality of actually meeting her would be different from the abstract concept he had lived with. Sarah had been supportive of David's search for Emma, but she might have complicated feelings about welcoming a grown daughter into their established family dynamic. David pulled into his driveway just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The house looked the same as it had when he left that morning, but everything felt different now. Inside this house was the family he had built in the years since Emma's disappearance. Soon, if everything went well, that family might expand to include the daughter who had been lost to him for 23 years. He sat in his truck for several minutes, gathering the courage to go inside and share the most important news of his life with the people he loved most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult conversations, but tonight, for the first time in over 2 decades, David Chen fell asleep knowing that his daughter was alive and that he would see her again soon. The front door of David's house had never felt heavier as he stood on his own porch, keys in hand, trying to find the words to explain the impossible day he had just lived through. Through the living room window, he could see the warm glow of lamplight and the familiar silhouettes of his family going about their evening routine. Sarah was curled up on the couch reading a book, and 12-year-old Michael was sprawled on the floor working on what appeared to be a science project, his dark hair falling across his forehead in the same way David's did when he concentrated. This was the life David had built in the aftermath of losing Emma, a good life filled with love and stability and the kind of ordinary happiness that he had once thought would be impossible to achieve again. Sarah had entered his world 8 years ago like a gentle spring rain after a long drought, bringing healing and hope when he had almost given up on the possibility of either. Michael had been the unexpected blessing that proved David's heart was capable of expanding to love another child without diminishing his devotion to the daughter he had lost. Now, as he stood on the threshold between his past and his future, David understood that everything was about to change again. The family he had worked so hard to build would soon include a daughter who was a stranger, grandchildren he had never met, and complications that none of them could fully anticipate. David finally turned the key and stepped inside, the familiar sounds and smells of home enveloping him like a warm embrace. Michael looked up from his project with a grin that reminded David so much of his own childhood that it took his breath away. "Dad, you're home late," Michael said, scrambling to his feet. "Mom said you had to help someone who got hurt. Are they okay?" Sarah marked her place in her book and rose to greet David with a kiss. But when she saw his face, her expression immediately shifted to concern. After 8 years of marriage, she knew David well enough to recognize when something significant had happened. "David, what is it?" Sarah asked gently, taking his hands in hers. "You look like you've seen a ghost." David glanced at Michael, who was watching the exchange with the sharp intuition that children often possess when they sense that adult conversations are veering toward territory that might affect them. David had always been honest with Michael about Emma's existence and his ongoing search for her, but explaining the day's revelations would require careful consideration of how much information a 12-year-old could process. "Why don't we sit down?" David said, leading Sarah to the couch while Michael perched on the edge of the coffee table, clearly not willing to be excluded from whatever conversation was about to unfold. David took a deep breath and began with the most basic facts. He explained about witnessing the woman being thrown from the train, about finding her injured by the railroad tracks, and about her mysterious knowledge of his name. Sarah listened with growing concern, while Michael's eyes grew wide with the drama of the story. When David reached the part about Maria knowing Emma's name, Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, "Oh my God, David, what did she tell you?" David's voice was steady but filled with emotion as he shared the impossible news. "Emma is alive, Sarah. She's been living in Indiana for the past 20 years with a family who adopted her illegally. She's 25 years old now, she's a teacher, and she's married with 2 children of her own." The silence that followed was profound. Sarah stared at David as if trying to process words that seemed too extraordinary to be real. Michael, meanwhile, was grappling with the concept that his half-sister, who had always been more of an abstract idea than a real person in his mind, was suddenly a concrete reality with her own family. "She has kids?" Michael asked, his voice small and uncertain. "That means I'm an uncle?" David nodded, pulling out the photograph that Maria had given him. "Her son Alex is 4 years old, and her daughter Lily is just 6 months old." Sarah took the photograph with trembling hands, studying the image of the woman who had been at the center of David's life long before she had met him. "She's beautiful," Sarah whispered. "She looks like you." "She looks like Lisa too," David said quietly, thinking of his first wife who had never recovered from losing Emma. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, her mind clearly racing through the implications of this discovery. David knew that she was probably experiencing a complex mixture of emotions: joy that Emma had been found, concern about how this would affect their family, and perhaps some anxiety about sharing David's attention with the daughter he had never stopped loving. "What happens now?" Sarah asked finally. David explained about Agent Thompson and the federal investigation, about the need to coordinate with Emma's adoptive parents, and about the delicate process of approaching Emma with information that would fundamentally alter her understanding of her own identity. "The FBI wants us to wait a week while they coordinate with authorities in Indiana," David said. "But Sarah, I don't know if I can wait that long. I've already waited 23 years. Sarah squeezed David's hand. "We'll wait," she said firmly. "If there's one thing I've learned from being married to you, it's that doing things the right way is always better than doing them the fast way." Michael had been unusually quiet during this conversation, and David could see that his son was struggling to process the magnitude of what he had learned. "Michael, how are you feeling about all of this?" The boy looked up at his father with eyes that seemed older than his 12 years. "I always wondered what it would be like to meet Emma," he said slowly. "But I never thought about her having her own kids. Does this mean our family is going to get bigger?" "I hope so," David said honestly. "But it's going to be complicated, buddy. Emma doesn't even know that she was adopted, much less that she has a biological father and a half-brother who have been thinking about her all these years." Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where they had built their life together. "David, what if she doesn't want a relationship with us? What if learning about her kidnapping traumatizes her or causes problems with her adoptive family?" These were the same fears that David had been wrestling with since leaving the hospital. "I don't know," he admitted. "But Maria said that Emma deserves to know the truth about her origins, and I believe that's right. Whatever happens after that, at least you'll have the choice." The conversation continued late into the evening, with all 3 family members asking questions and exploring scenarios that ranged from heartwarming reunions to devastating rejections. They talked about how they would introduce Michael to his half-sister, how they would navigate relationships with Emma's adoptive family, and how they would help Emma's children understand their expanded family tree. When Michael finally went to bed, David and Sarah remained in the living room, holding each other and processing the emotional weight of the day's revelations. Sarah had always been David's anchor during the difficult years when his search for Emma had consumed much of his emotional energy, and he needed her wisdom now more than ever. "Are you okay with this?" David asked Sarah as they prepared for bed. "I know this isn't what you signed up for when you married me." Sarah turned to face him, her expression soft but determined. "David, I fell in love with a man who would never stop looking for his daughter. That's part of who you are, and it's part of what I love about you." Finding Emma doesn't change our marriage or our family. It just makes our family bigger. David felt a rush of gratitude for the woman who had chosen to love him despite the complexity of his past. I'm scared, he admitted. What if I've built Emma up in my mind to be someone she's not? What if we can't connect after all these years? Then you'll figure it out together, Sarah said simply. But David, from what that social worker told you, Emma became exactly the kind of person you would have hoped she would become. She's kind, she's dedicated to her work, she loves her family. Those are the values you would have taught her if you had raised her yourself. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching David's mood as he prepared to go to the police station to provide his detailed statement about the events. At the railroad tracks, Agent Thompson had called early to confirm their appointment and to update David on the progress of the federal investigation. At the police station, David found himself in a conference room with Agent Thompson, Officer Martinez, and two other federal agents who had driven down from Louisville overnight. They had transformed the small room into a makeshift command center, with photographs, charts, and documents spread across every available surface. Agent Thompson began by showing David surveillance photographs of the men who had attacked Maria on the train. The images were grainy and taken from a distance, but they clearly showed two large men forcibly restraining a woman in the doorway of a freight car. We believe these men are Raymond Pike and Marcus Stevens, Agent Thompson explained. They're enforcers for the trafficking network that Maria was investigating. Both have extensive criminal records involving assault, kidnapping, and extortion. David studied the photographs, committing the faces to memory. These were the men who had tried to silence the woman who had brought him news of his daughter. Have you found them? Not yet, Agent Thompson admitted. But we have leads. The freight train they were on was bound for Chicago, and we're working with railroad security to track their movements. One of the other agents, a woman who introduced herself as Agent Collins, spread out a large organizational chart on the conference table. Mr. Chen, we want you to understand the scope of what Miss Santos uncovered. This trafficking network has been operating for over 30 years, and they've placed hundreds of children with families who believe they were participating in legitimate adoptions. David examined the chart, which showed a complex web of connections between lawyers, doctors, social workers, and what appeared to be legitimate adoption agencies. At the center of the chart was a box labeled Kellerman Organization, with lines connecting it to numerous other entities. The people who took your daughter were part of a sophisticated operation, Agent Collins continued. They identified target families, created opportunities to take children, and then placed those children with families who were willing to pay large sums for quick, no-questions-asked adoptions. Agent Thompson pulled out another file. We've been in contact with authorities in Indiana, and they're prepared to approach Carlos and Isabel Rodriguez today. We want to explain the situation to them before we make any contact with Emma. David felt his heart rate accelerate. Today? You're going to tell them today? We think it's important to move quickly, Agent Thompson explained. The longer we wait, the greater the risk that someone from the trafficking network will try to silence other witnesses or destroy evidence. The Rodriguez family needs to know what's happening so they can protect themselves and help us protect Emma. David understood the logic, but he also felt a deep anxiety about how Emma's adoptive parents would react to learning that their daughter had been kidnapped rather than legitimately adopted. What if they don't believe you? What if they think this is some kind of scam? Agent Collins smiled reassuringly. We have extensive documentation, including DNA evidence that proves Emma's identity. The Rodriguez family will have no choice but to accept the truth. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with the federal agents briefing David on the legal complexities of the case, the timeline for the investigation, and the procedures they would follow for arranging a meeting between David and his daughter. By the time David left the police station, he felt emotionally drained, but also cautiously optimistic that the authorities were taking his case seriously. When David returned home, he found Sarah in the kitchen making lunch while Michael sat at the table working on homework. The normalcy of the scene was comforting after the intensity of the morning's meetings, and David felt grateful for the stability that his current family provided. "How did it go?" Sarah asked, setting a sandwich in front of David. David summarized the meeting, explaining about the federal agent's plan to contact the Rodriguez family and about the complexity of the criminal investigation. They said they might have news about the initial contact with Emma's adoptive parents by this evening. Michael looked up from his math worksheet. "Dad, what if Emma's other parents don't want her to meet us?" It was a perceptive question from a 12-year-old, and David appreciated his son's ability to grasp the complicated dynamics of the situation. "Then we'll have to respect their feelings, buddy. The Rodriguez family has raised Emma for 23 years. They have a right to be protective of her." "But what if Emma wants to meet us and they won't let her?" Michael persisted. Sarah intervened gently. "Michael, Emma is an adult. No one can prevent her from making her own decisions about whether she wants to meet your father. But we want to make sure that everyone involved feels comfortable and safe." David spent the afternoon trying to distract himself with work, but his concentration was scattered and he found himself checking his phone every few minutes for updates from Agent Thompson. Sarah, recognizing his restlessness, suggested that they take Michael to his soccer practice and then go out for dinner as a family. The soccer field was a welcome reprieve from the emotional intensity of the past 24 hours. David stood on the sidelines watching Michael run drills with his teammates, surrounded by other parents who were dealing with the ordinary challenges of 12-year-old athletics, rather than federal investigations and long-lost daughters. "You're quiet tonight," said Janet Morrison, another soccer parent who had become a friend over the years. David realized that he had been so absorbed in his own thoughts that he had barely spoken to anyone. "Just a lot on my mind," he said, not ready to share the extraordinary news with casual acquaintances. As the sun began to set and the soccer practice wound down, David felt his phone vibrate with an incoming call. Agent Thompson's name appeared on the screen, and David's heart began to race as he answered. "Mr. Chen, I have an update on our contact with the Rodriguez family," Agent Thompson said without preamble. "We met with Carlos and Isabel this afternoon, and I have to tell you, it went better than we expected." David stepped away from the other parents to hear the call more clearly. What did they say? "Initially, they were shocked and disbelieving," Agent Thompson explained. "But when we showed them the evidence and explained the circumstances of Emma's kidnapping, they became very cooperative. There are as much victims in this situation as you are." David felt a wave of relief wash over him. "So they're willing to help?" "More than willing," Agent Thompson confirmed. Carlos Rodriguez broke down when he realized that they had unknowingly participated in a kidnapping. Isabel said that they've always wondered why the adoption process seemed so unusual and why they were never able to get complete medical records for Emma. David was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "Have they told Emma yet?" "No, and that's where it gets complicated," Agent Thompson said. "They want to be the ones to tell her about her true origins, but they're asking for time to figure out how to approach the subject. Emma is apparently very close to both of them, and they're worried about how this news will affect her." David understood their concern, but he also felt frustrated by the prospect of another delay. How much time are they asking for? "They want to talk to Emma this weekend," Agent Thompson said. "Carlos Rodriguez said that he wants to sit down with his daughter and explain everything before she hears about it from anyone else. They've asked us to wait until after they've had that conversation before we arrange any contact between you and Emma." David closed his eyes, feeling the weight of another postponement. "And what if Emma doesn't want to meet me after she learns the truth?" "Then we'll respect her decision," Agent Thompson said gently. "But Mr. Chen, I have to tell you that Carlos and Isabel Rodriguez spoke very highly of Emma." They described her as a compassionate, open-minded person who values family above everything else. They believe that once she processes the initial shock, she'll want to meet you. The call ended with Agent Thompson promising to contact David immediately after the Rodriguez family had their conversation with Emma. As David rejoined his family for the drive home, he felt cautiously optimistic but also deeply anxious about how Emma would react to learning that her entire understanding of her identity was based on a lie. That evening, as the Chen family sat around their dinner table, David found himself imagining Emma sitting at her own dinner table with her husband and children, unaware that in just a few days, her world would be turned upside down. He wondered what kind of evening routine she had with her family, whether she helped her 4-year-old son with homework or read bedtime stories to her baby daughter. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked, noticing David's distant expression. "I'm wondering what Emma's life is like," David admitted. "What kind of mother she is, what her house looks like, whether she's happy." Michael, who had been unusually thoughtful since learning about his half-sister, spoke up. "Do you think she'll like us?" David reached across the table and squeezed his son's hand. "I think she'll love you, Michael. How could she not?" The next few days passed in a blur of nervous anticipation and mundane routine. David tried to focus on his construction work, but he found himself making mistakes and having to redo tasks that he normally completed without thinking. Sarah was patient with his distraction, taking over household responsibilities and managing Michael's schedule, while David struggled to maintain his emotional equilibrium. On Friday afternoon, David's phone rang with a call from an unfamiliar Indiana number. When he answered, a woman's voice spoke hesitantly. "Is this David Chen?" "My name is Isabel Rodriguez. I think Agent Thompson told you that we would be calling." David's heart began to race. This was Emma's adoptive mother, the woman who had raised his daughter for 23 years. "Yes, Mrs. Rodriguez, thank you for calling. Please call me Isabel," she said, her voice warm but strained. "David, I wanted to talk to you before we speak with Emma tomorrow. Carlos and I have been trying to figure out how to handle this situation, and we wanted you to know that we're committed to doing what's best for everyone involved." David was struck by the kindness in Isabel's voice, despite the impossible circumstances. "I appreciate that, Isabel. I know this must be incredibly difficult for you and your husband." "It is," Isabel admitted. "But David, I want you to know that learning the truth about how Emma came to be with us doesn't change how much we love her. She's our daughter in every way that matters, and will support whatever decision she makes about meeting you." David felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Thank you. That means more to me than you can know." Isabel was quiet for a moment before continuing. "David, I want to tell you about the woman Emma has become, because I think it will help you understand her when you meet." For the next 30 minutes, Isabel shared stories about Emma's childhood, her academic achievements, her dedication to teaching, and her devotion to her own family. She described a young woman who was confident and successful, but also deeply compassionate, someone who volunteered at the local animal shelter and organized charity drives for underprivileged children. "She's going to be shocked when we tell her the truth," Isabel said. "But David, I believe that once she has time to process everything, she'll want to know you." Emma has always been curious about her medical history and her family background. We've never been able to give her those answers. The conversation ended with Isabel promising to call David immediately after they spoke with Emma. As David hung up the phone, he felt a profound sense of gratitude toward the woman who had raised his daughter with such obvious love and care. Saturday arrived overcast and humid, with the kind of oppressive weather that seemed to match David's emotional state. He woke early and spent the morning pacing around his house, unable to focus on any activity for more than a few minutes. Sarah and Michael gave him space, understanding that he needed to process his anxiety in his own way. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, David's phone rang. The caller ID showed Isabel's number, and David answered on the first ring. "David." Isabel's voice was thick with emotion. We told Emma everything." David's hands were shaking as he held the phone. How did she take it? "About as well as you might expect," Isabel said. She was shocked, confused, angry, sad, all at the same time. She asked a million questions that we couldn't answer. But David, when we showed her the photograph that Agent Thompson gave us, of you and Michael, she stared at it for a long time. David's heart was pounding. What did she say? "She said that she could see the resemblance," Isabel replied. "And then she asked if you really had been looking for her all these years. What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth," Isabel said simply. "That you never stopped loving her or searching for her, and that finding her was the most important thing in your life." David was crying now, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. "Does she want to meet me?" Isabel's voice was gentle but clear. "Yes, David. Emma wants to meet you. She wants to meet her biological father and her half-brother. She wants to understand where she came from and what her life might have been like if she had never been taken." The relief that flooded through David was so intense that he had to sit down. After 23 years of wondering and searching and hoping, his daughter wanted to see him again. "When?" David asked. "When can I see her?" "She wants to meet you tomorrow," Isabel said. "She said that waiting any longer would just make her more nervous. Carlos and I would like to be there for the initial meeting to help ease the transition. For everyone." David agreed immediately, his mind already racing ahead to imagine what it would be like to see Emma face to face, to hear her voice, to finally have the reunion he had dreamed about for over 2 decades. As he hung up the phone and shared the incredible news with Sarah and Michael, David realized that tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter in all of their lives. His family was about to expand in ways that would challenge and enrich them all, and for the first time since that terrible day in October 23 years ago, David Chen felt complete. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that painted the Indiana countryside in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. David had barely slept, his mind cycling through countless scenarios of how the reunion with Emma might unfold. He had rehearsed conversations, imagined embraces, and worried about awkward silences until Sarah finally convinced him to get out of bed and channel his nervous energy into something productive. The drive to Millbrook, Indiana would take just over 3 hours, giving David time to process his emotions, while Sarah handled the navigation and Michael peppered them both with questions from the back seat. They had decided as a family that all 3 of them would make the trip, understanding that this reunion would affect each of them in different ways. "What if she doesn't like me?" Michael asked for the 4th time as they crossed the state line into Indiana. Sarah turned in the passenger seat to face her son. "Michael, she's going to love you. You're her little brother, and from everything we've learned about Emma, family is the most important thing in the world to her." David gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white with tension. What if I don't know what to say to her? What if 23 years is too long to bridge? "Then you'll figure it out together," Sarah said gently, the same advice she had been offering all week. "David, you're not trying to erase 23 years or replace the parents who raised her. You're just trying to connect with your daughter as the people you both are now." The town of Millbrook appeared around a bend in the highway like something from a Norman Rockwell painting. Main Street was lined with red brick buildings housing a hardware store, a diner, a small library, and a flower shop with colorful mums displayed in wooden barrels on the sidewalk. The elementary school where Emma taught was a modest 2-story building surrounded by maple trees that were dropping their leaves like golden confetti. David had arranged to meet Emma and her adoptive parents at Riverside Park, a small recreational area on the outskirts of town that Isabel had suggested, because it would be neutral territory and would offer privacy for their conversation. As they pulled into the gravel parking lot, David could see a woman sitting on a bench near the playground, watching the small boy climb on the monkey bars while holding a baby in her arms. Even from a distance, David knew immediately that this was Emma. She had the same dark hair that he remembered from her toddler years, though it was now shoulder length and pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her posture was straight and confident, but David could see tension in the way she held her shoulders. An older couple, presumably Carlos and Isabel Rodriguez, sat on a nearby bench, giving Emma space while remaining close enough to offer support. David parked the car and sat for a moment, his heart pounding so hard that he was sure Sarah and Michael could hear it. This was the moment he had dreamed about for 23 years, but now that it was here, he felt paralyzed by the magnitude of the occasion. "Dad," Michael said softly from the back seat, "she's really pretty, and she looks like you." David turned to look at his son, this wise 12-year-old who had grown up in the shadow of a missing sister but had never resented the attention that David's search had required. "Are you ready to meet her, buddy?" Michael nodded, though David could see that he was nervous too. "Do you think she want to be my sister for real?" "I think she already is your sister for real," Sarah said. "Blood doesn't make family, love." "Does, but today you get to add blood to the love." They climbed out of the car slowly, David's legs feeling unsteady beneath him. As they approached the playground area, Emma looked up and their eyes met across 30 yards of grass and fallen leaves. The recognition was instantaneous and profound, a connection that transcended the decades of separation. Emma stood up carefully, settling the baby more securely in her arms while keeping one eye on her son Alex, who was now hanging upside down from the monkey bars with the fearless abandon that only 4-year-olds possess. She took a few tentative steps toward David's family, her expression a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and something that might have been hope. David found himself walking faster, closing the distance between them with long strides that carried him across years of longing and uncertainty. When they were finally standing face to face, just a few feet apart, both of them stopped and simply stared at each other. Emma was beautiful in a way that reminded David of both himself and Lisa. But she was also uniquely herself. Her eyes were darker than he remembered, more serious, and there were small lines around them that spoke of years of laughter and concern, and the everyday responsibilities of motherhood. She was wearing jeans and a green sweater that brought out the color of her eyes, and she held herself with the confidence of a woman who was comfortable in her own skin. "You're taller than I expected," Emma said finally, her voice soft and slightly husky. David laughed, a sound that was part joy and part nervous relief. "You're exactly what I hoped you would be." They stood there for another moment, both of them struggling with the awkwardness of not knowing how to greet each other. Were they strangers who happened to share DNA, or were they father and daughter whose relationship had been interrupted but never broken? Emma made the decision for both of them by stepping forward and opening her free arm for an embrace. David moved into the hug carefully, mindful of the baby she was holding and of the fragility of this first physical contact. When his arms closed around his daughter for the first time in 23 years, David felt something inside his chest that had been clenched tight for decades finally begin to relax. The hug lasted longer than either of them had expected, and when they finally separated, both of them had tears in their eyes. Emma wiped her cheek with the back of her hand and gestured toward the baby in her arms. "This is Lily," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She's 6 months old." David looked down at his granddaughter, a tiny person with wispy brown hair and curious dark eyes that seemed to be studying his face with remarkable intensity. "She's perfect," he whispered. "And that monkey over there is Alex," Emma said, pointing toward the playground where her son had moved on to conquering the slide. "Alex, come here for a minute, sweetie. I want you to meet some special people." The 4-year-old bounded over with the boundless energy that David remembered from Michael's early childhood. Alex was a sturdy little boy with his mother's dark hair and eyes that sparkled with mischief and intelligence. "Alex, this is my biological father, David," Emma said carefully. "And this is Sarah, his wife, and Michael, who is my half-brother." "That means he's your uncle." Alex looked up at David with the frank curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to be self-conscious. "Are you really my grandpa?" he asked. David knelt down to bring himself closer to Alex's eye level. "I would be honored to be your grandpa, if that's okay with you." Alex considered this seriously for a moment, then turned to Michael. "Are you really my uncle?" "You're not very big for an uncle." Michael grinned and knelt down beside David. "I'm still growing. But I'm definitely your uncle. Want to see something cool?" Michael pulled a small toy car from his pocket, one of many that he collected and carried with him wherever he went. Alex's eyes lit up with delight, and within minutes the two boys were on the ground together, racing cars down the slide and chattering about their favorite vehicles. Emma watched this interaction with a soft smile, and David could see her beginning to relax slightly. "He doesn't usually warm up to strangers that quickly," she said. "But then again, you're not really strangers, are you?" Sarah stepped forward with the warmth that had drawn David to her 8 years earlier. "Emma, it's so wonderful to finally meet you. David has talked about you every day since I've known him." Emma looked at Sarah with genuine interest. "That must have been difficult for you, being married to someone who was constantly thinking about another woman." "Not another woman," Sarah corrected gently. "His daughter. There's a difference. Besides, I always knew that if we found you, our family would just get bigger and better." Carlos and Isabel Rodriguez had been hanging back, giving Emma space to navigate this initial meeting, but now they approached the group with cautious smiles. David felt a complex mixture of emotions as he prepared to meet the people who had raised his daughter. These were the individuals who had been Emma's parents for 23 years, who had shaped her values and supported her dreams, and comforted her through difficulties. "David," Carlos Rodriguez said, extending his hand. He was a compact man, in his 60s with graying hair and calloused hands that spoke of decades of honest work. "I'm Carlos. Isabel and I want you to know how sorry we are about what happened to your family." David shook Carlos's hand, surprised by the strength of his grip and the sincerity in his eyes. "Thank you for taking such good care of her," David said, "for raising her to be the wonderful person she clearly is." Isabel Rodriguez was a small woman with kind eyes and an aura of quiet strength. When she hugged David, he could smell the faint scent of flour and vanilla that suggested she had been baking that morning, perhaps to calm her own nerves about this meeting. "We've loved Emma every day of her life," Isabel said simply. "And we want you to know that our loving her doesn't take anything away from your love for her." Emma was listening to this exchange with tears in her eyes. "I keep thinking I should feel angry or confused or betrayed," she said. "But mostly I just feel grateful. Grateful that I had you," she looked at Carlos and Isabel, "and grateful that I had someone who never stopped looking for me." She turned to David. They spent the next hour sitting on picnic tables under the trees, sharing stories and trying to piece together the narrative of Emma's life. David learned that Emma had been an excellent student who had received a scholarship to Indiana University, where she had studied elementary education. She had met her husband James during her junior year, and they had been married for 4 years. James Walker turned out to be a quiet, thoughtful man who worked as a computer programmer for a company in Indianapolis. He arrived at the park about an hour into the reunion, having spent the morning with his parents who were babysitting their other grandchildren. David could see that James was protective of Emma and slightly suspicious of this sudden influx of new family members, but he was also clearly committed to supporting whatever Emma needed. "This is all pretty overwhelming," James admitted after being introduced to David's family. "Yesterday Emma thought she knew everything about her background, and today she's got a whole new set of relatives." Emma reached for her husband's hand. James has been incredible through all of this, she told David. When Carlos and Isabel told me about the kidnapping yesterday, he immediately said that we should meet you as soon as possible. David felt grateful toward this man who loved his daughter and was willing to embrace the complications that her true identity would bring to their lives. I hope you know that I'm not trying to disrupt your family, David told James. I just want the chance to know Emma and to be part of her life in whatever way feels comfortable for everyone. As the afternoon progressed, the conversation became easier and more natural. Michael and Alex had become fast friends, with Michael taking on the protective older brother role with an enthusiasm that warmed David's heart. Sarah and Isabel discovered a shared interest in gardening, while Carlos and David found common ground in their appreciation for hands-on work and their devotion to their families. Emma proved to be everything that Isabel had described and more. She was articulate and thoughtful, with a sense of humor that reminded David of his own mother. She asked intelligent questions about David's life, his search for her, and his family with Sarah and Michael. She also shared stories about her work as a teacher, her volunteer activities, and her hopes for her children's futures. I have to admit, Emma said during a lull in the conversation, there's something surreal about sitting here talking to my biological father. I keep looking at you and seeing pieces of myself that I never understood before. David nodded. I know what you mean. When I saw you walk toward us earlier, it was like watching a home movie of my own mother. You have her walk, her way of holding your head when you're thinking. Emma's eyes widened. I have a grandmother? Tell me about her. David spent the next 20 minutes describing his mother, who had died 5 years earlier, but who had never stopped hoping to meet her kidnapped granddaughter. Emma listened with rapt attention, clearly hungry for information about the family she had never known existed. She would have loved you so much, David said. She kept a photo of you as a toddler on her kitchen table until the day she died. Every time I visited her, she would ask if there had been any news about you. Emma wiped away tears. I wish I could have met her. She knew about Michael, David continued. She was so excited to be a grandmother again, but she always said that her heart wouldn't be complete until she could hold both of her grandchildren. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, the extended family began to discuss practical matters. Emma lived just 10 minutes away from the park, in a small house that she and James had bought 3 years earlier. David's family was staying overnight in a hotel in the next town, planning to drive back to Kentucky the following day. I don't want this to end, Emma said suddenly. I know that sounds crazy since we just met, but I feel like I've been waiting my whole life for this conversation without even knowing it. David's heart swelled with hope. What are you thinking? Emma looked at James, who nodded encouragingly. I'm thinking that maybe you could come to our house for dinner tonight. James is actually a pretty good cook, and I'd love for you to see where we live, where your grandchildren are growing up. The invitation felt like a gift beyond measure. David looked at Sarah, who smiled and nodded. We would love that, David said. As they prepared to leave the park, Alex ran up to Michael and tugged on his sleeve. Uncle Michael, are you going to come to our house too? If it's okay with your mom and dad, Michael said, looking hopefully at Emma. Emma knelt down and put her arms around both boys. Of course it's okay. Alex, you and Uncle Michael can show everyone your toy collection. The caravan of cars that made its way through the quiet streets of Millbrook included representatives from 3 different families who were in the process of becoming one larger, more complex, but undeniably connected unit. David followed Emma's small sedan, marveling at how normal this felt despite the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. Emma's house was a modest 2-story home with a front porch lined with pumpkins and a yard scattered with children's toys. Inside, the rooms were painted in warm colors and filled with photographs that chronicled Alex's growth from infancy to his current exuberant 4-year-old self. David found himself studying these pictures with fascination, seeing echoes of Emma's own childhood in her son's expressions. The kitchen was clearly the heart of the home, with children's artwork displayed on the refrigerator and a high chair positioned next to a table that had obviously seen countless family meals. James began preparing dinner while Emma gave David's family a tour of the house, pointing out the nursery where Lily slept and the playroom where Alex's extensive collection of cars and trucks was displayed on shelves that James had built himself. "This is wonderful," Sarah said as they returned to the kitchen. "You've built such a warm, loving home." Emma smiled. "We've been happy here. It's not fancy, but it's ours." David was struck by how similar Emma's values were to his own. Despite the years of separation and the different circumstances of their lives, she had chosen to prioritize family and community over material success, just as he had always tried to do. Dinner was a revelation in normalcy. They sat around the kitchen table, passing bowls of pasta and salad while Alex chattered about his upcoming birthday party, and Lily sat in her high chair, alternately eating mashed peas and throwing them on the floor. The conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from Michael's soccer season to Emma's plans for her classroom Halloween party. "Dad," Michael said during dessert, "can I ask Emma something?" David nodded, curious about what his son was thinking. Michael turned to Emma with the serious expression he wore when he was working through complex ideas. "Do you wish you had grown up with us instead of with Carlos and Isabel?" Emma was quiet for a moment, clearly giving the question the thoughtful consideration it deserved. "That's a really hard question, Michael. Part of me does wonder what my life would have been like if I had never been taken from your father. But the truth is, Carlos and Isabel are my parents in every way that matters. They loved me and supported me and helped me become who I am today." She looked around the table, her gaze taking in both sets of parents. "I think what I'm realizing is that I don't have to choose between my two families. I can love everyone and be grateful for all the different ways that love has shaped my life." James reached over and squeezed Emma's hand. "That's very wise," he said. "And I think it's what everyone here wants for you." After dinner, the adults sat in the living room while Michael and Alex played with toy cars in the corner. Baby Lily had fallen asleep in Emma's arms, and David found himself mesmerized by the sight of his daughter cradling his granddaughter. The scene was so peaceful and natural that he could almost forget the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. "David," Emma said suddenly, "can I ask you something personal?" "Anything," David replied. "What was the hardest part?" "About losing me, I mean. What was the thing that hurt the most?" David was quiet for a long moment, thinking about how to answer honestly without burdening Emma with the full weight of his grief. "The not knowing," he said finally. "Not knowing if you were safe, if you were loved, if you were happy. Not knowing if I would ever see you again." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that." "Don't apologize," David said firmly. "None of this was your fault. You were a baby and you couldn't control what happened to you. But Emma, I want you to know that even during the darkest times, I never regretted having you. Loving you gave my life meaning, even when I didn't know where you were." Carlos Rodriguez, who had been quietly listening to this exchange, spoke up. "David, Isabel and I want you to know that we understand how much pain our having Emma must have caused you. We're grateful that she was placed with us instead of with people who might have hurt her, but we're also deeply sorry for what you went through." David looked at this man who had been a father to his daughter for 23 years. "Carlos, you and Isabel gave Emma the childhood that I wanted her to have. You kept her safe and loved and helped her grow into an amazing woman. I could never resent you for that." As the evening wound down, the families began to discuss plans for staying in touch and building ongoing relationships. Emma wanted to bring her children to Kentucky to meet David's extended family, including Sarah's parents who had embraced the role of surrogate grandparents to Michael. David and Sarah offered to visit Indiana regularly, understanding that Emma's roots were firmly planted in the community where she had grown up. "I want Alex and Lily to know their grandfather," Emma said. "And I want them to know Michael as their uncle. Family is the most important thing in the world to me, and our family just got bigger." When it was time for David's family to return to their hotel, the goodbyes were emotional, but not final. They made plans to see each other again in 2 weeks, when Emma and her family would drive to Kentucky for a weekend visit. "This feels like a dream," Emma said as she hugged David goodnight. "A really good dream that I don't want to wake up from." David held his daughter close, marveling at how right it felt to have her in his arms again. "It's not a dream," he said. "We found each other, and this time I'm never letting you go." As they drove back to their hotel, David felt a sense of completion that he had never experienced before. His family was whole again, expanded and enriched by the addition of Emma and her children. The search that had defined his adult life was over, but the relationship with his daughter was just beginning. "How do you feel?" Sarah asked as they settled into their hotel room. David was quiet for a moment, trying to find words for the emotions that were flooding through him. "Grateful," he said finally. "Grateful to Maria for finding Emma. Grateful to Carlos and Isabel for raising her so well. Grateful to James for loving her. And grateful to you and Michael for embracing her so completely." Michael, who was getting ready for bed, looked up at his father. "Dad, do you think Emma's kids will really think of me as their uncle?" "I think they already do, buddy," David said, remembering how naturally Alex had taken to Michael. "And I think you're going to be an amazing uncle." As David lay in bed that night, listening to the quiet breathing of his wife and son, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The search for Emma had cost him his first marriage, consumed years of his life, and caused him more pain than he had ever thought possible to endure. But it had also led him to Sarah, to Michael, and ultimately back to Emma herself. Tomorrow they would drive home to Kentucky, where they would begin the process of integrating Emma and her family into their daily lives. There would be challenges ahead, complications to navigate, and relationships to build. But for the first time in 23 years, David Chen fell asleep knowing that his daughter was safe, loved, and part of his life again. The miracle he had never expected was not just finding Emma, but discovering that the family he had lost could be rebuilt in ways that were even richer and more complex than what had been taken from him. Love, it turned out, was not diminished by being shared among more people. It was multiplied, creating connections that would last for generations to come. 6 months had passed since that life-changing moment when David pulled over beside the railroad tracks, and the rhythms of his expanded family had settled into something beautiful and unexpected. The prosecution of the trafficking network had made national headlines, with Maria Santos receiving recognition for her courageous investigation that had led to the arrest of 12 individuals across 4 states. The network that had operated for decades was finally dismantled, bringing justice not only for Emma, but for dozens of other families whose children had been stolen and sold. David stood in his backyard on a warm spring Saturday, watching as Alex chased Michael around the swing set that they had installed just last month. The sound of children's laughter filled the air as Emma pushed baby Lily in the infant swing, her face glowing with the contentment that had become her natural expression since the family reunions had become a regular occurrence. "Uncle Michael, catch me!" Alex shouted as he raced across the grass, his 4-year-old legs pumping with determination. Michael, now 13 and reveling in his role as the responsible older uncle, scooped Alex up and spun him around before setting him down gently. The bond between the two boys had grown stronger with each visit, creating a relationship that transcended the unusual circumstances of their connection. Sarah emerged from the kitchen carrying the pitcher of lemonade and wearing the peaceful smile that had become even more radiant since their family had expanded. "Lunch is almost ready," she called out. "James, how are those burgers coming along?" James stood at the grill, spatula in hand, looking completely at home in David's backyard, despite the fact that 6 months ago he had never heard of the Chen family. "5 more minutes," he replied, flipping the patties with the careful attention he brought to everything involving his family's well-being. Carlos and Isabel Rodriguez sat at the picnic table under the oak tree, playing a gentle game of peekaboo with Lily while keeping one eye on Alex's energetic exploration of the yard. The relationship between Emma's two sets of parents had evolved into something remarkably harmonious, built on their shared love for Emma and their mutual respect for each other's roles in her life. "David," Isabel called out, "Emma was just telling us about the teaching award she received. We're so proud of her." Emma blushed slightly at the attention. "It's not that big a deal. Just a recognition from the district for innovative classroom methods." "It is a big deal," David said firmly, walking over to put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "You're making a difference in children's lives every single day. That matters more than any other kind of success." The pride in David's voice was unmistakable, and Emma leaned into the embrace with the natural affection that had developed between them over the months of rebuilding their relationship. The initial awkwardness had given way to genuine fondness and a growing understanding of each other's personalities and values. Agent Thompson had become a regular visitor to both families, not in his official capacity, but as someone whose life had been touched by their story. He had called just that morning to update them on the final sentencing of the trafficking ring leaders, bringing closure to a case that had consumed years of investigation. The last of them got 25 years, Thompson had reported. And Maria Santos is being honored by the FBI next month for her work on the case. None of this would have happened without her willingness to risk everything for the truth. Maria herself had become like an honorary aunt to both families, visiting regularly and maintaining a special connection with Emma that went beyond the professional relationship that had brought them together. She was currently recovering well from her injuries and had returned to her work with a new assignment focusing on family reunification cases. As the extended family gathered around the picnic table for lunch, David marveled at how natural this felt. The conversation flowed easily between topics ranging from Alex's upcoming kindergarten enrollment to Michael's baseball season to Emma's plans for summer vacation with her students. "Dad," Emma said during a pause in the conversation, "I've been thinking about something, and I wanted to discuss it with everyone." David looked up from his burger, noting the serious tone in Emma's voice. "What's on your mind?" Emma glanced around the table at all the faces she had come to love over the past months. "James and I have been talking about moving closer to Kentucky. We found a teaching position in a district about an hour from here, and there's a computer programming job for James with a company in Louisville." The announcement created a moment of stunned silence before everyone began talking at once. Sarah's face lit up with excitement, while Carlos and Isabel exchanged glances that mixed happiness with concern. "That would be wonderful," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "But Emma, I don't want you to uproot your life just to be closer to us. You have a home in Indiana, friends, a community." Emma reached across the table to take her father's hand. "David, I've realized over these past months that home isn't just a place. It's where your family is. James and I want Alex and Lily to grow up knowing their grandfather, their uncle, and their extended family. We want to be part of your daily lives, not just weekend visitors." Carlos Rodriguez spoke up, his voice gentle but tinged with sadness. "Emma, you know that Isabel and I will support whatever decision you make, but Indiana has been your home for your entire life. And you'll always be my parents," Emma said firmly, looking at Carlos and Isabel with eyes full of love. "Distance doesn't change that. You raised me, you shaped who I am, and you'll always be Alex and Lily's grandparents. But I want them to know all of their family, and I want to be part of David's life in the way I should have been all along." Isabel wiped away a tear and reached over to squeeze Emma's hand. "Then we'll just have to visit Kentucky more often," she said with watery smile. James had been quietly listening to this exchange, and now he spoke up. "We've already talked to a realtor, and we think we found a house that would work for our family. It's in a good school district, and it's close enough to Kentucky that we could see everyone regularly, but far enough away that we'd still have our own space." Michael looked up from his plate with excitement. "Does this mean Alex will be able to come to my baseball games?" "It means Alex will probably want to play on the same teams as his uncle," Emma said with a laugh. As lunch continued, the practical details of the potential move were discussed with the kind of careful consideration that had characterized every major decision since the family reunification began. Emma and James had clearly thought through all the implications, from career moves to housing to the impact on Alex's adjustment to kindergarten. David found himself struggling with conflicting emotions. The prospect of having Emma and her family nearby filled him with joy, but he also worried about the sacrifices they would be making and the disruption to the life they had built in Indiana. "Emma," he said finally, "I want you to be absolutely certain about this. Moving is a big decision, and I don't want you to feel pressured by anyone, including me." Emma's expression grew serious and determined. "David, I've spent 6 months getting to know you, and what I've learned is that I inherited your stubbornness. When I make up my mind about something important, I don't change it easily. This is important." Sarah had been unusually quiet during this discussion, and now she spoke up. "Emma, I want you to know that having you closer would be a dream come true for all of us. But I also want you to know that we'll love you and be part of your life no matter where you live." The conversation was interrupted by Alex running up to the table with a handful of dandelions that he had picked from the yard. "Mommy, these are for you," he said, presenting the wilted flowers with the pride of someone offering the crown jewels. Emma accepted the dandelions with the gravity that the gift deserved. "Thank you, sweetheart. They're beautiful." Alex climbed into his mother's lap and looked around the table at all the adults who had been having such an intense conversation. "Are we going to live near Grandpa David and Uncle Michael?" he asked with the directness that only 4-year-olds possess. "Would you like that?" Emma asked her son. Alex considered this question seriously. "Yes, because then I could play with Uncle Michael every day, and Grandpa David could teach me how to build things like he taught Uncle Michael." David's heart melted at the mention of teaching Alex the construction skills that had been such an important part of his own relationship with Michael. "I would love to teach you how to build things, Alex. We could start with a treehouse." "Can Uncle Michael help too?" Alex asked. "I wouldn't miss it," Michael said, grinning at his nephew. As the afternoon wore on, the families began making concrete plans for Emma's potential move. Isabel offered to help with the house hunting process, while Carlos suggested that he could help with any renovations that the new house might need. The practical support was matched by emotional encouragement, with everyone recognizing that this decision represented another step in the ongoing process of family integration. Later that evening, as Emma and James prepared to drive back to Indiana with their children, David found himself standing in the driveway, having a quiet conversation with his daughter, while the others said their goodbyes. "Are you sure about this move?" David asked one more time. "I want you to know that I'm happy with whatever relationship we can have, even if it's just occasional visits." Emma smiled and shook her head. "David, I lost the first 23 years of knowing you. I don't want to lose any more time. Besides, I think Alex and Lily deserve to grow up with their uncle and their grandfather as regular parts of their lives." David pulled Emma into a hug, marveling once again at how natural this physical affection felt after months of rebuilding their relationship. "I love you, Emma. I'm proud of the woman you've become, and I'm grateful every day that we found each other again." "I love you too, Dad," Emma said, the word coming easily now after months of practice. "And I'm grateful for the family I had and the family I found in the family we're all building together. As the taillights of Emma's car disappeared down the street, David stood in his driveway with Sarah and Michael, all of them processing the magnitude of what had just been discussed. "Can you believe this is really happening?" Sarah asked, taking David's hand. "I'm still getting used to the idea that any of this is real," David admitted. "6 months ago, I thought Emma was lost forever. Now she's talking about moving closer, so that our families can be more integrated." Michael, who had been unusually thoughtful during the evening's discussions, looked up at his parents. "Dad, do you think Emma moving here will change things between us?" David knelt down to his son's level, understanding the concern behind the question. "Michael, having Emma in our lives doesn't change how much I love you or how important you are to our family. It just means our family gets bigger and more interesting." "And more complicated?" Michael asked with a grin. "Definitely more complicated," David laughed. "But the best things in life usually are." 3 months later, David stood in the living room of Emma's new house, helping James hang pictures while Emma directed the placement of furniture, and Alex ran around exploring every room with the excitement of a child discovering a new playground. The house was located in a small town 30 minutes from David's home, close enough for regular visits but far enough away to give Emma's family their own space and independence. The moving process had been emotional for everyone involved, with Carlos and Isabel making multiple trips to help their daughter establish her new home while also coming to terms with the reality that their daily involvement in Emma's life was changing. But the sadness of increased distance had been balanced by the joy of watching Emma's children develop stronger relationships with their Kentucky family. "A little to the left," Emma called out as James adjusted a family photograph that included representatives from all 3 generations and both sets of grandparents. "Perfect," Sarah said from her position on the floor, where she was helping Alex unpack a box of toys. "This house is going to be wonderful for your family." Baby Lily, now crawling and getting into everything, had discovered the fascinating texture of the new carpet and was making her way toward the kitchen with single-minded determination. David scooped up his granddaughter and settled her on his lap, marveling at how quickly she was growing and changing. "She's going to be walking soon," Emma said, taking a break from directing the furniture arrangement to join David on the couch. "Michael was about this age when he took his first steps," David said, bouncing Lily gently on his knee. "I remember thinking that once he could walk, my life would never be peaceful again." Emma laughed. "That's exactly what I'm dreading. Alex was into everything once he became mobile, and I have a feeling Lily is going to be even more adventurous." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, followed by Alex's excited shout of "Uncle Michael." Michael had arrived with Isabel and Carlos, who had driven over from their hotel to help with the final day of moving. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as the extended family worked together to transform the house into a home. Pictures were hung, furniture was arranged, and boxes were unpacked with the kind of collaborative efficiency that had become the hallmark of their family gatherings. As evening approached and the house began to look settled, David found himself standing in the backyard with Emma, watching as Michael pushed Alex on the swing set that had been one of their first purchases for the new house. "Do you have any regrets?" David asked his daughter as they observed the peaceful scene. Emma was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "About the move? No, not at all. About the years we lost? Sometimes. But mostly I just feel grateful for the years we have ahead of us." David nodded, understanding the complexity of emotions that came with their unique situation. "I feel the same way. I can't change what happened to you as a child, but I can be the father and grandfather I want to be from now on." "You already are," Emma said simply. As the sun set over their new neighborhood, the extended family gathered for takeout pizza in Emma's living room, sitting on boxes and mismatched chairs, while Alex regaled everyone with his plans for decorating his new bedroom. The scene was chaotic and imperfect and absolutely perfect at the same time. Later that night, after everyone had returned to their respective homes, David lay in bed reflecting on the journey that had brought his family to this point. The woman thrown from the train had given him the greatest gift imaginable, the return of his daughter and the expansion of his family in ways he could never have anticipated. Maria Santos had called earlier that week to check on Emma's move and to share news about her own life. She had been promoted within her department and was now heading a new unit focused specifically on family reunification cases. Her work with Emma's case had opened doors to helping other families find their missing children, creating a legacy that extended far beyond their personal story. The trafficking network that had destroyed so many families was now completely dismantled, with the surviving members facing decades in prison. The investigation had led to the recovery of several other children who had been placed through illegal adoptions, bringing closure to families who had been searching for answers for years. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome of the entire ordeal was the proof that families could be rebuilt, expanded, and redefined in ways that honored both the past and the future. Emma had not been forced to choose between her adoptive parents and her biological father. Instead, she had created a larger definition of family that included everyone who loved her. As David drifted off to sleep, he thought about the railroad tracks where the story had begun, and how a single moment of witnessing someone in distress had led to the recovery of everything he thought he had lost forever. Sometimes the greatest miracles came disguised as the worst tragedies, and sometimes the people who needed rescuing ended up being the ones who did the rescuing. The sound of children's laughter would fill his house again soon, David knew. Emma had promised to bring Alex and Lily over the next weekend to help plant a garden in the backyard. 3 generations working together to grow something beautiful from the earth, creating new memories to fill the spaces where old ones had been lost. David Chen fell asleep that night, knowing that his search was finally over, not because he had found what he was looking for, but because what he had found was even better than what he had lost. His family was whole again, different than it had been before, but stronger for having been broken and rebuilt with intention, love, and the kind of grace that comes only from forgiveness and hope. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.